Thank you for your stalwart and courageous stand for life tonight. Women deserve better than abortion, and of course celebrating an extraordinary organization such as Priests for Life, who have tried to heal the wounded and protect those who are most vulnerable, is of course an extraordinary cause. Mr. Speaker, as my colleagues and I gather on the floor, I am going to turn the subject to another matter, because we are possibly marking what could possibly be considered one of the most significant turning points in the history of our nation, but it is not a cause for celebration. In America, we have a legacy of principle that undergirds our nation and makes it possible to create prosperity, not just material means, but a flourishing of the potential of each person. And where does that principle come from? Well, we've all heard the line from the earliest of our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. It goes like this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. This is the operative philosophical paradigm of our culture, so much so we don't even think about it, that our rights are not conferred by a king or a government, they are inherent, based upon the dignity of each person. And as we worked this out in the early stages of our development of our country, we wrote a constitution which basically did one thing. It defined power. And it defined power as coming from the consent of the government, consistent with our operative philosophical paradigm of the inherent dignity and rights and responsibilities of each individual person. Beyond that, the consent of the governed turns that power over to representatives, who then make prudential judgments about what is in the common good. We make law and are held accountable by the people in elections. Third, we spread that power out. We developed three branches of government. The Congress makes the law, the President enforces the law, the judiciary interprets the law, in order that we have even more balance of power to ensure that it is not abused. But then we took it a step further. There were still concerns that we had defined where power is coming from the natural inherent dignity of the person, but we also wanted to define what government must not do. And so we wrote the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitutions. And in the First Amendment, it starts with these words: Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It continues, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, Mr. Speaker, the threats to religious liberty in our country are often more subtle than in other parts of the world. But as a legislator, what has grieved me deeply is that for the first time in the history of health care in the United States, Americans are being forced to choose to either obey the government or violate their personal convictions. Buried in the President's 2010 health care law was a provision empowering the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, to issue rules on preventative services. Who could have predicted that she would use her authority, sanctioned by President Obama, to force everyone to purchase drugs and procedures, including abortion-inducing drugs, that violate the fundamental ethical sensibilities of many Americans? No American should be forced to choose between their conscience and their livelihood. No American should be forced to stand for their deeply held reasoned beliefs or stand convicted by government coercion. No American should be forced to choose between their faith and their job. This is wrong. It is a false choice. It is unjust. It is unnecessary. It is un-American, and it is an affront to the very purpose of our government derived from the consent of the governed. America owes its unique character and strength to empowering, protecting, and upholding the inalienable rights of her citizens. Health care should be about the common good, caring for the sick, and healing the wounded. Healthcare policy should not be a vehicle to drive divisive ideology, forcing Americans to violate deeply held beliefs. The Health and Human Services mandate violates the fundamental principle of religious liberty and the rights of conscience so dear to this country. America owes its unique character and strength to empowering, protecting, and upholding those rights of her citizens. Mr. Speaker, Karen McGivney-Lechtel, one of my constituents, sent me this email. Quote, "As a women's health practitioner and a Catholic, I need the ability to stay within my faith boundaries. I would be unable to work if I was required to provide the services this mandate has imposed." Indeed, it is sad that the Health and Human Services ruling seems most perniciously targeted at faith-based providers who are the backstop of compassionate care for our most vulnerable. Throughout our history, the U.S. healthcare system has in large measure owed its success to the doctors and nurses and healthcare providers staffing faith-based institutions. These institutions, including hospitals and university clinics, nonprofit health institutions, serve the common good of all Americans. The government should celebrate the contribution of these faith-based entities who fulfill the mission of helping the sick and serving the poor. Without them, we will see reduced access to high-quality care, especially for vulnerable persons who have traditionally relied on these benevolent organizations of civil society. In fact, Mr. Speaker, several healthcare practitioners have told me personally that they would choose to leave their professions rather than compromise their beliefs. But undoubtedly, some will not obey the government, and our government has effectively condemned them. Another man who was condemned for his beliefs had this to say: "I submit that an individual that breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law." So wrote Dr. Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail. The purpose of our government is to create just structures for societal order, empowering liberty, beginning with the affirmation of the natural rights of the person, including the most basic right of conscience. In my office, there is a copy of a draft of the Bill of Rights. The rights of conscience were initially included in that draft, but by the final version, that right was formalized by the concept of religious freedom, perhaps given that the rights of conscience were such an ordinarily understood concept that its fullness did not need provision. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, wrote this. He declared that conscience is the most sacred of all property, linking conscience rights to the foundation of religious liberty. In 1809, Thomas Jefferson stated that no provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of civil authority. The Health and Human Services mandate violates the fundamental principle of religious liberty and rights of conscience, so dear to our country. No American should be forced to choose between violating their conscience in order to serve the public. From the faith-based hospital to the business person providing health care coverage in their insurance plan to their employees, to the school established for children with special needs. No American should be forced to choose between their faith and their job. This is why so many people of goodwill, regardless of their religious traditions or their political affiliations, consider the Health and Human Services mandate to be a gross affront to the very essence of what it means to be an American. And all of us must choose our response. This is not simply a religious issue. It's not a Catholic issue. It's not an evangelical issue. It's an American issue. We all have a responsibility to decide, informed by our faith, what our country means to us and what it demands of us in this moment. Last Friday, there was a federal judge who ruled on a court case in this regard, and I think federal Judge John Kane in Hercules versus Sebelius got it right. He had this to say: the government's interests are countered and indeed outweighed by the public interest in the free exercise of religion. With that, I yield back.